Okay, all right. Add it up.
Hello and welcome to In the Community. I'm Joe Dexter. Glad to have you along this Thursday as we discuss COVID-19 prevalent across the country and right here in our local community. We'll take a look at local numbers coming up here in just a bit, but we have a big show for you today. Keith Gagnon will join us. He's a researcher and professor at Southern Illinois University and a Reidsville High School graduate. He'll talk about the variant that his lab discovered coming up in just a bit. I also want to remind you as well, too, you can ask your questions in the comments section. Just add them in the comments section, and we'll be sure to involve Keith with those questions. Let's take a closer look now at the COVID-19 numbers that we're seeing right here in our community. Let's take a closer look at how COVID-19 is impacting our local community. Current updated statistics, 6,338 lab-confirmed cases as of this morning. That's up 202 from the last In the Community live stream and up 55 from just yesterday. 77 deaths have been reported in our community. That's 4 in the past 2 days, and 93 are currently hospitalized. 27% of positive cases are full recoveries, and 70% of confirmed individuals are at home or recovering. That means close contacts of that 70% may still be active in our community. That's important to know. 59% of cases are individuals 40 and over, and Rockingham County has a 9% positive test rate over the last 14 days. Over 5,000 tests have been given out over the last 2 weeks. This is In the Community. We now welcome in Keith Gagnon, who is with Southern Illinois University, a researcher and professor. His lab did find a new variant, a U.S. variant, SARS-CoV-2. Keith, a Reidsville grad. First, I'll say go Rams, and then secondly, I'll say please give us some information on the project that your team has been working on and the information that was released last week.
Okay, I have headphones in. Let me try without here.
Now we got you.
Hear me okay?
Yep, we got you.
Sounds good. Yes, I'm at Southern Illinois University. Graduated from High. And we have been working on understanding the SARS-CoV-2 virus with this COVID-19. And what my lab does is we actually sequence the virus genome. So we learn about every single base or nucleotide, every level of the genome, and then we follow that over time and how it's changing. And as we were working on that over this break, we were making a big push to identify this UK variant, and that was working with the CDC and our local Department of Public Health. And over the course of doing that, we identified, surprisingly, a variant that appears to be very specific to the United States. It was sort of born and raised in the U.S., so to speak. So we know it started here in the U.S., in the southern parts of the U.S., and it seems like the Texas area, and really has just grown and taken over the United States and hasn't expanded much beyond the U.S. yet because of just international travel is very restricted right now. And so that's what the announcement we made a few weeks ago and what we're following up on right now.
For those in the comments, if you could just let me know that the doubling, if it's stopped, I believe I fixed the issue, but I just want to make sure. Keith Gagnon joins us with Southern Illinois University, his team working on that U.S.-specific coronavirus variant. How important is research in this COVID-19 fight? I don't think we talk about it enough. I think we're just day to day, we're looking at the numbers. We're looking more closely at the things we can do to fix issues. as far as wearing a mask in those cases, but genome research and research in general is going to be key, not only for now, but in the future, as this virus, I'm sure, is with us for quite some time not the near, but the far future as well.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Joe. The genomic sequencing is a sort of a new, maybe to the rest of the world, sort of a new approach, but something that's been done for a long time with the seasonal flu, for example. People don't realize, but about 7,000 samples from around the U.S. every year for the seasonal flu are sent to the CDC, and they sequence every single letter of that virus's genome, and that helps them predict what changes might be occurring in the flu virus, and that then helps advise, what are the best vaccines we should make for next year. And so in a similar way, SARS-CoV-2, we knew from the very beginning that we should be sequencing its genome. The resources were really sort of sparse at the beginning. Obviously, rightly so, we were really focused on looking at just the cases and capturing positive case counts and tracking that. And now over the several months period of time, there's been a big buildup and a big need for the genomic surveillance, we call it. And we're learning a lot about the virus and the different variants, or you could think of them as different versions, where they picked up some different letters in their genomes. And that's only possible with the genome sequencing, honestly. And so going forward, this is going to be really important, and probably into the coming months and maybe even future years.
You probably get a little bit sick getting asked this question, but I think it's important for our community to understand basically what is a variant and why is it important to research these variants and do more learning on these variants. You talked about how important the research is. This isn't a one-time organism. This is a living organism, COVID is, that continues to grow and expand, whether it's in the UK or right here in the US with the variant that you found that's nearly 50% of cases.
Yeah, that's true. So I guess I'll go into teacher mode just a little bit, and hopefully nobody's eyes will gloss over as I talk a little bit about some of this biology. But so yes, it's sort of like a living organism. We know it's a virus, so it's not really alive per se, but it's sort of changing over time. You can almost think of it as evolution in real time. You can see the virus evolving and changing. And so what that means at the genomic level is it has about 30,000 letters. Think of it as a book that has all the code and information that virus needs in order to replicate itself, and go about its daily business. And that's like an instruction manual for it. It's like a cookbook, right? You open up your Betty Crocker cookbook. This is how you bake an apple pie. But at some point, your customers might say, hey, we don't like the apple pie anymore. So you change the recipe. So the virus is going to sort of pick up changes over time. Now, this is not sort of an active, like the virus doesn't, we personify viruses, right? But they don't really think like we do. It's picking up these mutations sort of randomly. It will change one of its letters to another letter just occasionally. And however, what happens though is you get this sort of selection where if it changes a letter that helps the virus survive better, maybe transmit better, maybe evade the immune system better, then that virus might survive and sort of take over the population of other viruses, if that makes sense. It's a little bit of a competition we think of when we're thinking about this sort of selection process. So hopefully that makes sense. That's kind of why we want to follow this virus, because at any point it could pick up a mutation that could be beneficial for it and detrimental for us. And of course, as scientists, we have a pretty good handle on which mutations or parts of that 30,000 book, what chapters to look at, what paragraphs are probably the most important. And that's where we focus our energy when doing this sort of variant screening.
Jenny Edwards has a question in our comments. At any point, does a virus mutate enough to become a different virus, or does it always stay as coronavirus?
That is an excellent question, because there's a lot of confusion about what are variants. A variant, if you want to be very technical, you could have two viruses and all you do is change one letter of one virus, and it's technically a different genetic variant. Now, when we as scientists say variants, what we're really implying, although we don't really say it, is that we call this a variant because it's acquired several new or multiple new changes to its genome. So lots of letters have changed, and so still a coronavirus, still SARS-CoV-2. However, at some point, if this SARS-CoV-2 virus picks up enough changes, it could become a new strain. Okay, so that's sort of the next level. You have variant. The next level would be a strain. And so some people may know that there was a much earlier SARS epidemic and pandemic. I think it was 2003. You can go way back. That was a coronavirus, but it was a different strain of the virus, right? So I use air quotes because that's just how I do. But different strain of the virus. However, at no point will the SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID-19 virus become a different type of virus. It will always be a coronavirus.
There's a lot of unknowns, as you've mentioned in your research. What are you looking for? What are the unknowns that you're searching for as researchers with the genome research that you're doing? And what resources do you believe this country needs to continue to advance it? Because I feel like there's probably a little bit more resources needed in the genome area to continue to develop the research you guys are looking to do.
Yeah, there's been a big push for more genome sequencing from the top. I mean, I think even, the president or those folks way at the top recognize this now. The CDC has been pushing for this for a while. And for those who don't know, the CDC is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. So they oversee a lot of this work. And luckily now there's a lot more sequencing going on. I like to think, I mean, there was, even before my lab got started, there were people working this area, but it was a big gap, right? In fact, we foresaw the need for this starting in April. In April and May, we started getting there's a lot of paperwork involved to receive samples and a lot of planning that goes into it. And so, luckily our lab was already up and running, sequencing, it sequenced a couple hundred virus genomes. By the time the rest of the world, the UK variant, we call it the UK, so the variant that first emerged in the UK. Before that one, when that came about in December, and all of a sudden we realized, wow, we can't see these variants unless we're sequencing their genomes. And also these variants are important because we know that small mutations can change its transmissibility, its virulence, so how severe your disease is going to be. So I think really what we're trying to do is we want to catch these changes early, right? We don't want to all of a sudden wake up and 50% of all the viruses in the US are a new variant, which is exactly what happened when my lab made our discovery. Unbeknownst to us, sort of in our own backyard, this variant emerged, grew quietly, basically took over. So about one in two cases in the US of COVID-19 are this new variant that we found. And so I guess that says, yes, we need to do a better job. I think we are doing a better job. It's going to get better. We shouldn't have any big surprises like that as long as my group and others are working in this area. And I guess the last thing I will say is the real power of science in this particular problem area is to have some predictability or some forecasting ability. So if we're seeing what changes are occurring, we can try to predict what we should be doing differently, or at least what to expect. The big question, obviously, is it going to evade the vaccine? Is it going to become a seasonal flu-like thing? Are people going to continue to get reinfected? These are the big questions we don't know either, but with the genome sequencing, hopefully we can address those.
Is there any way to predict or have any idea the unknown amount of variants that are out there? Is that something that you guys are looking at to try and determine? I mean, I imagine it's tough to call at this point.
So I can give you some numbers. The bottom line is we're sequencing, genome sequencing at a pretty low level we call sampling rate. So that means out of every 100 cases, we're sequencing less than one. And actually, it's even worse than that across the US. In every 1,000 cases, we're sequencing about 2 or 3. But that has gone up dramatically, and we want to be doing what like the United Kingdom, Britain is doing. They're more like around 7 per 100. So they're doing much better. And so with that sort of gap, we have to do a little bit of educated guessing, scientific guessing, right? We were sampling randomly and then seeing where things fall. There are literally thousands of known genomic variants of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that have been sequenced. And again, I want to go back now. I talked about the difference between a genetic variant. So there's thousands of genetic variants, but in terms of the variants that we as scientists are starting to care about, there's only a handful of the new ones, okay? But there's probably tens of thousands, because any individual virus that infects a person, by the time it's done its 2-week infection course, it will have acquired at least one new mutation on average. So that's each case. And if that is passed on to another person, and we know that when an infected person, gets COVID-19, they pass it on typically to at least one or more people. And so you've got to imagine how many mutations are occurring. And a lot of these mutations, now remember, are not good for the virus, and they might even make the virus less fit or less able to continue surviving. So it will sort of die off, if you will, or its transmission line will stop. So the ones we see are the ones that are as good or better typically than the original virus, and those are the ones that continue on. So there's multiple layers here. Hopefully I haven't made it too confusing, but there's multiple layers, lots of mutations going on, and the ones we see are the few that we sample and the ones that survive, if that makes sense.
Keith, you're answering questions in the comments without even knowing it. Jenny asking, do variants ever make the virus weaker, or do changes always make the virus more transmissible? Keith Gagnon,
Yes.
Keith Gagnon joining us here from Southern Illinois University. His team unlocking a new variant in the U.S., about 50% of cases. A Reidsville High School graduate. Glad to have him on in the community. If you have any questions in the comments, please drop them so we can address them with Keith, an expert in this field as looking at variants. It's the new part of coronavirus that is being talked about mostly in the media and spreading the news about it more. I want to ask a positive question, Keith, before I let you out of here in a couple minutes. Looking back in history with the Spanish flu, for example, and with the technology we have today, first and foremost, future researchers, it's got to be crazy to think about the technology and tools you have to address something that's unique as well for these future researchers. It's got to play a paramount factor in what these future researchers are going to be able to do in their life and their career. And it's got to be a cool teaching tool in that aspect.
I would agree with you there. Imagine the 1918 pandemic. We barely really understood viruses at that time in science. I mean, we understood them, but we had no idea of what we were really dealing with. Today, we know a lot about them. Coronaviruses, for example, have been studied for decades. And the original SARS pandemic, almost 2 decades ago, taught us a lot about the coronavirus that can infect people. And so we even though this pandemic took us by surprise, we had a lot of tools in place. A lot of it's been retrofitting, right? My lab, I'm not a virologist. My lab wasn't doing sequencing of viruses beforehand, but we had the tools, we had the expertise, and we knew that something had to be done. So we just, we jumped on it. That's kind of the power of new technology, I think, and it's fantastic. I can't imagine how much easier it's going to get for future scientists. It's pretty easy for us. I think the bottleneck we've had, though, is yet the technology's not quite as good as it could be. Getting funding, getting buy-in from the government. The reason why the UK and some other countries have had a little bit more success is not just because they have a smaller population, but they have a slightly stronger centralized government. And I know there are arguments for and against that sort of system, but in this situation, it really helped them because they were able to say, this is what we're going to do. And all the local states or provinces basically fall in line. Well, we just don't do that very well in the US, and that's hurt us a little bit in the respect of keeping up with these virus variants. So
he's Keith Gagnon. He is a researcher at Southern Illinois University and a professor as well of chemistry, a Reidsville High School graduate, joining us here on In the Community. The big news, breaking that variant as well that causes more than 50% of cases here in the United States. From a research perspective, Keith, I have to ask because, as you mentioned, broken down in separate communities is how this has been handled for coronavirus. From this community perspective and a research and data and analytic perspective, how important is it to take this virus and its variants seriously?
Oh, it's extremely important. The vaccine was developed against one version. So far, it seems like it's It's working pretty well against some of these new versions that we're seeing that were first observed in, you may have heard of one in South Africa. There's one that was first observed also in Brazil. These are what we call variants of concern. They have changes that really reduce the effectiveness of the vaccine and seem to be driving reinfection in these parts of the world. So we really need to keep a close eye on this. Now, what is different between the one that my lab has sort of characterized in the US versus these others is it does not have certain mutations that are considered kind of scary. It somehow, although that's the interesting thing about it, it somehow has risen to dominance and sort of taken over the virus population in the US without having any of these particular mutations that are most concerning. And for people who are following the virus a little bit closely, what I'm referring to is mutations in a protein called the spike protein. That is where we're most concerned. So what bothers me is that this variant in the US has risen to dominance and taken over without any of those mutations. And what we are starting to see is it's now acquiring mutations in its spike gene. And so what I'm afraid of is that we are going to have we already have our own homegrown variant, but it's going to continue to evolve into something a little bit worse. And so I think it's extremely important to follow this, make sure we catch it ahead of time. We are preoccupied with these other international variants. And yes, they have some concerns. However, due to international restrictions in travel, due to the fact that these variants are at a pretty low level in the US still, I think our biggest threat still remains what could be homegrown here. And so that's sort of, I feel like my lab is taking on the hometown watchdog role, if you will, to keep an eye out for these. I know the CDC and everyone's doing a pretty good job with the other ones, but I don't want something to pop up unexpected for us in the US.
He's Keith Gagnon with Southern Illinois University. He's a chemistry professor in biochemistry as well as a researcher. The work your lab did, Keith, we're proud of you here in Rockingham County. Thanks for the work that you're doing and glad to have you on In the Community here on Dexter Media. Thank you for stopping by, and we really appreciate it.
I wanted to say thank you to all my teachers and people at Reidsville High, in particular, Mrs. Woody. She may remember me. She inspired me in biology and inspired me to go to college. I had a lot of other great people that inspired me and kept me on the right track. So I appreciate everybody's support, and thank you. Thanks a lot, Joe.
He's Keith Gagnon joining us here, Southern Illinois University. Man, the work that he did with his team, and his team too deserves all the credit as well in discovering that variant here in the U.S. It's about 50% of cases at this point, and saying so many key words for our community and the United States in general. Whether you're vaccinated or not, or whether you are going to get the vaccine, it doesn't mean that everything is in the clear right now. And researchers are working so hard to identify the things that we need to do. And it's people like Keith and his lab that we really need to thank. I'm glad to have Keith Gagnon here on the show, a Reidsville High School graduate in the community. Glad to have him here. And you can follow his work as well at Southern Illinois University. I also want to thank you folks for commenting and asking questions and joining us here on this broadcast. You can join us next Wednesday as well in the community, typically on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. on Dexter Media on all of our platforms. You can find us as well, joedextermedia.com. Thanks again to Keith. Thanks to our community for always being there. And remember, be safe. Think about the things that you're doing and how it affects your common man and the man next to you. Humanity is what will carry us through this virus. Have a great day, everybody.
Okay, all right.